If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is for ever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam.
Those lines were written by Rupert Brooke at the outbreak of the First World War. His poem, The Soldier, was published in March 1915, a few weeks before his premature death, a death his words foreshadowed.
Sub-Lieutenant Brooke had sailed with the British Mediterranean Expeditionary Force on the 28th of February 1915. He fell ill with gastroenteritis, followed by sepsis from an infected mosquito bite. He died on St. George's Day on a French hospital ship moored in a bay off the Greek island of Skyros. The ship was under orders to steam immediately to Gallipoli, so Brooke was hurriedly buried in an olive grove.
Brooke was proud of the soldier in his poem. He wanted him to be remembered.
But what if someone doesn't want to be remembered? What if they want to die anonymously in a foreign field? To be neither remembered nor forgotten? In fact, as though they never existed.
Welcome to the mystery of the Isdal-woman. It's time to head to the cold, dark side.
Hi, I'm Pip Watts, and I first heard about Isdal-woman from the BBC podcast series Death in Ice Valley. And I know Jack is equally fascinated by the case. So, if you're sitting comfortably, we shall begin. First things first, who was the Isdal-woman? Well, that's the root of the mystery and the theories surrounding her death, because nobody knows. Her body was found in a remote valley near Bergen in Norway in 1970, and the rest is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Thank goodness we've got former Murder Squad detective Jack Morell on hand to examine the evidence with his laser focus.
Well, according to the Norwegian coroner, the unnamed woman's death was suicide, not murder. And like Pip, I fell under the spell of the Isdal-woman after listening to the BBC podcasts and reading a book about the case by Norwegian investigator Dennis Ask. Oh, and by the way, Isdal means ice valley in Norwegian. Anyway, the lack of identification led to a raft of theories as curious people tried to fill in the gaps. Was her death linked to Cold War espionage? Was she a Nazi hunter? Was she done in by the mafia or some other organised crime group? Or did she, as the coroner concluded, simply take her own life for reasons we will never know?
The purpose of Death in Ice Valley was to re-examine the case in the hope that the woman could now be identified, her family traced, and the mystery of her death solved. That was back in 2018, but Norwegian authorities still refused to reopen the case.
Having read the public response to Death in Ice Valley, I've concluded that we as humans have certain traits. We like to think there's something sinister in an unusual death. It satisfies our curiosity when there's a possibility of a cover-up. We also don't like to think that people can die alone without someone being concerned about their disappearance.
Yeah, we mentioned missing people in our episode, The Aussie Croc Killer. It was incredible that there are so many unidentified human remains in Australia. All of them, you would hope, have relatives or friends who wondered what happened to them.
You would indeed. In my 30-year police career, I saw my fair share of the anguish around missing persons. There are a myriad of reasons why people disappear. One reason, though, is that they choose to, and we have to respect that. I've dealt with many cases where we trace the missing person only to find them safe and well, but they ask us not to disclose their whereabouts. These experiences qualify me to review the information made available in Death in Ice Valley. See what you think. We're going to summarise our interpretation of the case, and then We'll wrap things up with our conclusions.
A psycho killer case review on a freezing, windswept Norwegian hillside more than half a century ago.
On the 29th of November 1970, in the remote hillside near Bergen, the badly burnt body of a woman was found by a man and his daughters who were out walking, looking for juniper bushes. The body had been in situ for about a week. The police investigation lasted about 3 weeks. They found out she had stayed at a hotel in Bergen for a few days under the name Elisabeth Lienhofer. Strangely, the identity of Elisabeth Lienhofer didn't exist. Who on earth was she? The Bergen police started to dig deeper.
The woman had spent several weeks in Norway. She had stayed at a number of hotels and used a different name every time. All of them were false. By false, I mean they didn't exist officially anywhere. She claimed to be a Belgian national, but her handwriting was in either German or French. Remarkably, not one of the names existed on any nationality records.
Incredible, isn't it? Despite the problems in identifying the woman, the evidence pointed to suicide, and the coroner recorded it as such. She'd consumed a quantity of barbiturates, alcohol, and had set herself on fire. The case, as far as the Bergen police were concerned, was closed.
OK, we're all intrigued. Let's remind ourselves of what Bergen in Norway was like in 1970. Let's go to the lighter side of Bergen's recent history. Bergen is officially Norway's second city, with a population of around 280,000. But instead of a bustling metropolis, visitors can expect a quaint, town-like destination with those traditional and colourful Scandinavian houses and clean, pleasant streets. Nature is close by too. The city's surrounded by water on one side and mountains on the other.
In 1970, the population was less than half that. It was advertised as a friendly city of music, fish and fjords. Not only that, the city was celebrating its 900th centenary. By Scandinavian standards, it was a really old town.
Getting there was not that straightforward. You could get a daily boat service from Newcastle upon Tyne in England. You could get a flight from the USA. But you would have an 8-hour train trip through the ski country and over the mountains from Oslo. Bergen was once called Bjorgvin, meaning mountain meadows. The mountain part is the city itself, a mass of colourful buildings stuck to the sides of steep hills that drop sharply to the sea. The meadows lie beyond the rim of the mountains.
There's 2 ways of reaching the top of the mountains without climbing. A funicular railway, one of those that if you don't like heights, you get in the middle car where you can neither see in front of you or behind you. Or a gondola cable car. The views, as you can imagine, are special. Bergen is also a gateway to the fjords. The Sonja Fjord is to the north, and Stavanger is an overnight boat trip south.
Hey, look, we're all falling in love with Bergen. It sounds like a great place for a getaway. So why do you think this woman chose it? What was she doing in Norway for almost 4 weeks from the 29th of October 1970? Just think about the different names she used.
No fewer than 6 different names whilst in Norway from October to November. On October the 29th, she travels from Paris to Stavanger as Vera Schlosseneck, but checks into the hotel as Claudia Nielsen.
She then travels to Bergen and checks into a hotel as Alexia Zana Merches.
I hope you're keeping up. On November the 6th, she travels as E. Velding to Trondheim, checking into a hotel as Vera Jarl, then travels to Stavanger as L. Selling, checking into the hotel as Fenella Lork. She stayed there for over a week. On November the 18th, she travels to Bergen for the final time, where she checks into a hotel as Elisabeth Lienhofer. 4 days later, she checks out from her hotel and places the 2 suitcases in a storage box at the railway station. And then she vanishes.
5 days later, her body was found in Ice Valley. What strikes me as well is the names are all very different. The dates of birth are all different, around 1940 to 1945, and her writing changes between French and German.
Bear in mind, in 1970, you left less of a trace compared with the digital age of today. You gave a name. Sometimes you had to give your identity, such as at hotels. It is the hotel records that show the names she used. Please note too that whilst a passport should have been shown by foreign travellers at hotels, there's no evidence that a passport was physically checked.
But she always claims to be Belgian.
She wrote down a different employment each time, as well as the language used. As Lancia, she claims to be a secretary in French. As Tealt, an antique dealer in German. As Nielsen, a decorator in German. As Zana Merchers, a ceramic painter in German. As Leenhaufer, a business owner in German.
Now that's an awful lot of names and job titles for her to remember.
Incredible.
And don't forget, there were other hotel records indicating she was in Norway in March 1972, using 2 more names. First in Oslo as Genevieve Lancia, then in Bergen as Claudia Tealt.
You get the idea. All those names, the mixed up languages. Let's hear what the key points are and try to work out what on earth was going on with this woman. So, Jack, you're the professional. How did you go about your review of the case?
Well, one of my roles in the police was incident room manager, and sometimes we had to review old cases. And this often happened when you guys in the media would tell us that you were doing a feature on a case and asking us for comment. Of course, we needed to be prepared for any information that may come from the publicity. In order to manage that, I would need to get my head round what the key aspects were.
So take, for example, the location of this woman's body. What was found with the body? Wasn't there an issue with the labels having been removed from her clothing and the clothing recovered later from her suitcase?
That's right. There could be lots of interpretation as to why. But in a long-term investigation, the clothing would be a project in itself. What inquiries were made to identify the manufacturer and retailers? If this woman didn't wish to be identified, these kinds of inquiry can sometimes be the key to unlocking the mystery. You just never know.
A metal ring or rivet was found, potentially like those used to secure a photograph, suggesting that it may have come from a passport that had been destroyed in the fire.
Which nations use these? How many types or manufacturers were there? Or was it from something other than a passport?
I've seen this on German passports and French passports from the period, and I think this was a common method of fraud prevention across continental Europe. You couldn't take out the rivet and replace the passport photo without destroying the passport itself.
A pair of rubber sailor boots were found with the body. These are rubber sailor's boots, a bit like Wellington boots. They'd been purchased by the woman a couple of weeks earlier. This was the only known purchase of significance during her time in Norway.
Quite an unusual purchase too. Also a distinctive item of footwear. I would be wanting to know whether she had worn them only once, on the day of her walk to her death. If so, they may have served a purpose and showed an element of pre-planning.
And what about those 2 suitcases that the Isdal woman had deposited at Bergen railway station? This was at the left luggage facility on the 23rd of November, the day she checked out of her hotel. The suitcases contained more clothing, with the labels removed, and other items, a wig and clear glass spectacles, suggesting that she changed her appearance.
There was also a notebook in the suitcase. There was handwriting on a few pages, a series of numbers and letters. These appeared to be some kind of code or shorthand and were subsequently interpreted as a summary of her dates and visits to various cities in Europe.
We'll deal with the significance of this notebook later. But I would be asking, who was the manufacturer? Where was it retailed? What else was recorded in it? Has it been assessed whether this code had been written in one go or on different occasions? Had some pages been removed?
And there's ESDA testing, isn't there? A forensic way of examining documents to reveal indentations and impressions on pages that aren't necessarily visible to the naked eye.
There is. Electrostatic detection device, although this was developed in the late 1970s, I think, and by the time the case was closed, certainly as far as the Norwegian police were concerned. Just imagine if she'd written down some personal thoughts or information and then torn it out of the notebook.
I suppose the notebook has been destroyed by now. If the case was an unsolved murder, these forensic advances would be available to investigators now.
I wonder what kind of media appeals were made on the discovery of her body, and more importantly, what information came of it. There seems to be very little known about what she was actually doing in Norway, hence all the speculation about her.
You're right. And I also noted that Isdal-woman had previously stayed at a hotel in Stavanger for 9 nights, and that's a long time in a hotel. What inquiries were made at this hotel? What do they reveal about her lifestyle? She must have been remembered by staff at the time. If no one remembered her much at all, why?
So what were witnesses saying about this woman? We're told that she left Stavanger on the 18th of November, taking a taxi from the hotel to a hydrofoil boat and then on to Bergen. The taxi driver recalled she spoke in English, but not well. He recalls that she had a gap in her front teeth.
The police made inquiries at all the hotels and looked at the registration cards for the distinctive handwriting of Isdal-woman taken from her final stay in Bergen. They identify 7 other hotel registration cards in the same handwriting. All were in different names and had different passport numbers and addresses that didn't exist. In all of them, the woman claimed to be a Belgian national. Did anyone at these hotels state they saw the passport?
The short answer, yes, but no.
Ah, I see.
The hotel rules are that foreign nationals identify themselves by presenting a passport, and they state where they travelled from and were travelling to next. Officially, the staff would have to say they always see the passport. In reality, they probably rarely did.
What inquiries were made with the Belgian authorities?
Good question. The Belgians made checks and none of the names or passport numbers she gave were known to them.
These various visits to Norway appear to have been listed in that notebook, found in her suitcase that had been deposited in the left luggage facility at the railway station. We're not talking about a travel diary here. This was more a list of random numbers and letters, some kind of code or shorthand. What investigators were able to work out was it listed the dates and locations she'd visited. This matched the dates from the hotel records in Norway, but also had some other travel details that couldn't be identified.
Isdal-woman had also visited Norway, including Bergen, earlier that year, March to April. A hotel in Paris was also identified. On each occasion, Isdal-woman claimed to have been born in the 1940s, 1942 to 1945. The handwriting is the same, but the spelling changes between German and French. It also contains spelling errors. Interestingly, the handwriting from the final registration card, the 19th to the 23rd of November, appears to be written more hurriedly. The handwriting is later interpreted as in the French taught style.
OK, that's enough on the shorthand and coded travel history. Whatever her reasons for being in Norway, she was a woman travelling alone, staying in a country that spoke a different language. She must have surely spent time with others. The hotel staff must have got an idea of her lifestyle.
You would, although this was a conservative society, and it seems that this woman was not particularly approachable, possibly standoffish.
There were just 3 occasions when witnesses described IW being in the company of another person. All these were men and occurred during her final 5-day stay in Bergen. Number 1 was a grey-haired man who'd sat with IW at dinner at the hotel. IW looked serious and sad. They had little conversation. They spoke in German, and the man spent time reading something. Number 2 was with a man with a dark complexion who was seen in a home furnishing shop looking at a wall mirror. He was with a woman of a similar description to IW, but with curly hair. The suggestion was that this could have been a wig. They spoke in an unrecognised language. Number 3 was a blonde man, 25 to 30 years old, who was with IW in her room at the first hotel in Bergen on the 18th of November. They remained silent when the cleaner was in the room. The cleaner also stated that a table in Isdal-woman's room was moved on one occasion and placed upside down behind the door.
So in her final days in Bergen, these are 3 instances where the Isdal woman was seen in company with a man. It would not appear to be the same man, and the visit to the shop may not even be her. The other 2, though, are from accounts by staff at the hotel, so are more reliable. The question is, were they just acquaintances, or were they associates?
So, this woman arrives on her own. She spends at least 5 days in the town. Little is known about what she actually did with her time away from the hotel, but she is with 2 separate men, one in her room and one having a meal with her.
Isdal-woman was described as attractive, slightly exotic in her looks. She gives the impression of being confident and businesslike. She would almost certainly get attention from local men, and whatever their interest in her, maybe she's not rejected them outright, and met some of them. And don't forget, none of these men have been traced. None of them came forward, despite the public appeals at the time. They could be married men who would not want to come forward and admit to trying it on with a woman they met by chance. They could be casual acquaintances, well-meaning men who realised that there was something odd about this woman, and who then avoided her. When she was found dead in those circumstances, they probably thought it best to keep well away.
Let's ask the question that everyone asks at this point in the story. Was she a spy?
The murky and complex world of espionage will always keep the listeners happy, but this won't make the next James Bond film.
Apparently, there was an intelligence file related to the Isdal woman. It was created, and I stress, after her death, by the Norwegian police and security services. It was apparently not a particularly extensive document, but what did it refer to? Well, there was an interview with a trawler fisherman on the 22nd of December, 3 weeks after the body was found. This fisherman was named Bergen Rott.
Rott claimed that he recognised the Isdal woman from the publicity and the artist's impression of her. He claimed that he saw her on one occasion, we're presuming in November 1970, although it wasn't clear on the actual date. The woman he saw had been speaking to a Norwegian naval officer at a location near Stavanger. This had coincided with some military testing of the Penguin anti-ship missile system.
So this makes the quantum leap of the woman in conversation with the naval officer being IW, who, by her odd disappearance and use of false names, was spying for a foreign power and obtaining intelligence on the Norwegian missile defence system.
That's about it, and it should be stressed, the intelligence file only summarised Mr. Rott's account, rather than included the actual statement or notes of the interview, which is not available in the investigation file either. This Bergen Rott reminds me of the character in the James Bond film, Dr. No. Wasn't there a fisherman in that who got roped into taking Bond out in his boat, snooping around Dr. No's lair?
I remember that film too. His name was Quarrel. That was the character's name.
Ain't no use you struggling. Bus full of rats of alligators.
OK, let's take this on face value. Now, Mr. Rott has died, but the podcast team traced his son, who was aware of his father's claims. His understanding was that his father saw the Isdal woman walk past him while he was repairing his trawler net. The son also claimed that as a family they visited London that Christmas, within days of his father being interviewed, and his father was taken to one side and spoken to by officials at the port. His father had subsequently told his son that they'd issued him with a gun for his own protection. What do we think of that?
Without seeing all the documentation relating to Rott's interview, his account should be treated with extreme care. As a witness, he does not appear to have had anything more than a brief glimpse of a woman who he believed was similar to the artist's impression. This was also at least a month prior to him reporting the matter. So what drew him to remember the woman? And I'm afraid the claim about being provided a gun is fanciful in the extreme. I can only think he said this in jest to his young family. He was maybe enjoying his moment of fame as a star witness.
I wonder what follow-up inquiries were made with the naval staff. You know, if none, then it probably meant that they almost certainly discounted Mr. Rott's belief that he'd seen the Isdal woman.
I wonder if Mr. Rott spoke to the media a bit too openly, and reporting of it risked undermining the direction of the investigation.
Maybe he was warned about this by investigators. Maybe they told him to keep it to himself, and he convinced himself that he was caught up in some kind of spy thriller.
But even if the woman that Rott saw in Stavanger was not the Isdal woman, her behaviour was similar to a spy working undercover.
We also heard from an elderly Norwegian intelligence officer about the theory of Isdal-woman being a spy. He suggested the woman wasn't a spy, as none of the purported identities could withstand any scrutiny. Now, what do you think about that, Jack?
However bizarre this woman's behaviour was, it does not appear to fit the behaviour of a spy. He's right in that respect. Any covert activity is designed to not draw attention to yourself, to have credibility. If the Isdal woman was a spy, she would need to have a convincing cover story and the identity documents to back it up. The implication that she had several passports in her possession, going from hotel to hotel, the question would be, why? Whatever she was doing in Norway, it was unnecessary to have a new identity every other day.
I see what you mean. She stayed in 3 hotels in Bergen. I guess someone could have met her one day and chatted to her and taken her name as Claudia Tielt, and then 2 days later seen her at another hotel being called something else.
It's very risky and unnecessary. Not only is she using different names, but in the same town and at nearby hotels.
Members of staff could conceivably work at more than one hotel. She risked drawing attention to herself.
If she was working undercover for an organisation, for a country's security services, that is not good tradecraft. She would need one identity as a cover story, and remember, the original police investigation had to deal with the press speculation too. Either way, the investigation was wound down after 3 weeks, that's Christmas 1970, and the senior officer at a press conference concluded that she'd taken her own life. Despite the speculation that she may have been a spy, there was no evidence for it.
Well, if that line of inquiry has petered out to nothing, the next one, conducted by the Ice Valley podcast team, is sensational. They managed to obtain a DNA profile of the Isdal woman from her teeth.
After the inquest and the suicide verdict, the Norwegian police arranged the funeral of the Isdal woman, burying her in a Bergen cemetery with just a few police officers and a priest. Her jaw, though, was not buried with her, so there was no need to exhume her body. It was still held at the laboratory. Examination of the woman's jawbone produced a DNA profile.
I know with this case they were unable to trace the poor woman's next of kin. I also know from experience that body tissue and other parts were not often buried with the deceased person. Things have improved though. There's a process now that the police and the hospital inform relatives of the body parts. and they're asked how they want them to be disposed of.
Let's not dwell on that. They have the woman's DNA, so there's a chance of finding a relative, right?
Yeah, we'll come to that, and it's not that simple, I'm afraid.
It never is.
Her jaw, we should add, also had a number of gold teeth, and this was expensive dental work and was not considered Scandinavian, more likely German.
The scientific work taking place under the watchful eye of the Death in Ice Valley podcast team was now getting very interesting. In addition to establishing a DNA profile, they were examining the isotopes in her teeth. New technology that is able to show where in the world we lived when we developed into adulthood. What they were able to discover is, frankly, astonishing.
With further examination of her teeth, mitochondrial DNA, H24, revealed that the Isdal woman was of European descent, maternally. Isotopes from her teeth showed that as a child, she originated from southern Germany, but as a teenager, she grew up on the French-German border, which, of course, includes Belgium. Carbon dating of the teeth using the carbon-14 method and amino acid testing came up with her age. She was probably closer to 45 years old.
That's quite a bit older than the age she purported to be.
Indeed, 10 to 15 years older. Rather than being born in the 1940s, she was actually a child or even a teenager during the war.
Putting the DNA profile and the carbon dating results together, this indicated that she was originally from southern Germany and had then moved to the area around the border with France and Germany, the area that includes Belgium.
According to the isotope analysis, Isdal-woman's early childhood was in the Nuremberg area of southeast Germany. Now we know that she was older than she claimed, so this suggests that she would have grown up during the rise to power of Hitler and Nazism.
Could she be Jewish? You know, one of those that fled Nuremberg on the Kindertransport in the 1930s.
This is feasible. A child sent away and raised by another family. It would also explain her use of German words as well as French.
We're probably on the right lines here. She could have had a traumatic childhood, moving across Europe, born German and raised in France. Throw in her apparent knowledge of Belgium and claiming to be Belgian. Was she avoiding her true background for some reason?
Fascinating, isn't it? And to add even more to her complex European origins, there was a spoon that was found in her suitcase. The spoon had an engraving on the rear and was possibly a cherished item. Could this lead to finding out who she was? Unfortunately not. The spoon was in fact a mass-produced item manufactured by a company in Vienna. So she could be from anywhere.
The original senior investigating officer is now deceased, but we heard from his son, who revealed that his father was not happy that the case was closed so early. What do you think of that, Jack?
This is natural. It's like us getting involved now. We wish we could find the answers. Like in all professions, though, and policing is no different, there's an understanding that inquiries have to be closed down. We mentioned in an earlier episode of Psycho Killer about the difference between a sudden death investigation and a homicide. The same goes for someone taking their own life. Once the decision is made that there's no foul play, no third-party involvement, it's over to the coroner. Now, any detective worth their salt would still want to get to the bottom of a case like this, but sometimes it's just not viable.
Thanks, Jack. We also know that Isdal-woman was not pregnant at the time of her death, nor had she previously given birth to a child. Of course, that would have some relevance today with the DNA opportunities. The DNA of any direct descendants would be the most likely route to a match, as they would be more likely to use a genetic database for family. Unfortunately, that's not to be.
We also learnt that in the original investigation, that checks were made with Belgian authorities and all missing persons at the time were discounted.
Okay, let's summarise where we are with all this. What do we know for sure about the Isdal woman? She was born around 1930 to 35, making her older than she appeared, and older than the age she gave.
Her early childhood was spent in the Nuremberg area of southern Germany.
Her later childhood was in the area of the French-German border, an area that includes Belgium.
She wrote in a French style, suggesting that she went to a French-speaking school.
Nothing is known about her adulthood other than she had never given birth.
She had a gap between her top teeth and spoke with a lisp.
In 1970, at the age of around 40, she travelled around Europe using a random series of false names, birth dates, addresses and occupations.
She consistently claimed to be a Belgian national.
According to the hotel staff, she smoked cigarettes and smelled of strong perfume. She was described as strange. The housekeeper only serviced the room occasionally and recalled that a chair from the room was often placed outside the room.
She visits Norway and Bergen twice, apparently travelling alone. On the second and final trip, she flew from Paris to Stavanger via Amsterdam. She booked the flight in Paris and stayed at a hotel there. The evidence points to her actually being a French national. Now, Jack, can you explain that?
Well, firstly, the hotel forms from Paris are in the same handwriting as those in Norway. So it's the same person. It is Isdal-woman. That is the only time she described herself as French. Why? Because she was in France and staying at a Parisian hotel. She would only need a French identity card or passport, but there was no requirement for the hotel to check them. She filled out the hotel card using the name Vera Schlosseneck, although that was a false name. It's highly likely that she spoke fluent French too. It would have been risky to claim to be French but speak German or English.
So what about the immigration control when she landed in Norway as Vera Schlosseneck?
The only requirement in those days would have been for her to produce a passport. Whether it was in the name Vera Schlosseneck will never be known. If it was, it would have been a forgery. What we can be certain about is that she produced a French passport. We know this passport through a process of elimination, checking the flight manifest against those that landed in Stavanger.
How is that? Surely the immigration officers check and record all the details.
Stavanger airport arrivals were controlled by the police. People arriving showed their passport, but the name was not recorded. Just the nationality recorded for each arrival. It wasn't tallied against the names of who booked the ticket.
So, in 1970, people didn't have to legitimise when buying airline tickets or boarding an aeroplane. The passport control didn't have a copy of the passenger list, and they didn't compare the name on the passport with the ticket.
Correct.
So let's get this right. In Paris, she stated that she was French and had shown a French ID card. Nevertheless, the pattern here is the same as on the forms she filled out in Norway. She writes passport numbers and addresses that are non-existent. On the hotel form in Paris, she's completed everything, including the number of the ID card, and that was false. This indicates that it wasn't even requested or checked by the receptionist when she checked in. She stated that her name was Vera Lucille Schlosseneck, but the name, address and date of birth were false. We believe that she stated the correct nationality, though, so it's feasible that she would correctly state her home city. If she lied about that, it may come out in conversation.
You're on the right track here, Simon.
So what area did you say she was from?
On both of the Paris forms, she stated she was from Nancy.
And that's near the Franco-German border, just where those scientists said she'd grown up.
Exactly.
We seem to have discounted the spy theory. So what about the suggestion that she was a sex worker or a travelling criminal? There's even been some speculation of a South American check fraud gang operating around the same time.
There has, but I'm not convinced. She doesn't come across as someone working in the sex trade. Organised check fraudsters need to keep moving from town to town, bank to bank. They would rarely stay more than one night in a town. They would be more likely to travel in a group and by car. Isdal-woman seemed to travel alone and by public transport.
So what else do we know? In Norway, we know that she spoke English but with a foreign accent. This is from witnesses like hotel staff and taxi drivers who were Norwegian, and English was, and still is, usually the first common language to try to communicate in a foreign country. That doesn't take us anywhere, except that she didn't use or attempt to use French. She appeared serious and sad. She revealed nothing about herself in conversation. That doesn't seem to fit with the sex worker theory.
I agree. Her persona and her movements don't suggest she was a sex worker.
She removes labels from her clothing.
Odd behaviour maybe, but not really a method to avoid identity being known, is it?
She recorded her travel and unexplained events on that notepad using some kind of shorthand or code. That's very odd, isn't it?
The best way to describe how the information was recorded is to give an example. N9, N18, S. November 9th to November 18th, Stavanger, which we know was when she stayed there. The coded notes show a final entry of N18B, November 18th, Bergen.
So what was it?
It's almost certainly a shorthand way of recording her travel stay and her movements.
What benefit was it to her? It didn't show the names that she was using, bearing in mind she used so many. It's nothing more than a shorthand version of a diary.
It's all so odd.
Isdal-woman almost certainly grew up during the rise of Nazi Germany and the war in Europe. Her childhood may well have been disrupted as a result. She may have even been raised by an adoptive family. She may have had an early personality disorder. She may have suffered abuse during her childhood. She was in physically good health. She was described as having broad hips and strong legs.
There's no evidence that she held more than one passport, although she did provide false details at hotels. While we don't know her lifestyle prior to 1970, or indeed the periods between her travels in 1970, she had the means and character to visit different countries. She didn't appear to draw attention to herself. Had she not died in those circumstances, her travel would have been unremarkable and unnoticed.
We don't know why she chose to visit Norway. It's possible that Norway was a good place to remain anonymous and to avoid scrutiny. It has its own unique language, and therefore she could use other languages to get by as part of her detachment and anonymity.
I've tried not to get drawn into wild theories, but even I couldn't resist the possibility that she may have been revisiting the area, although she did not reveal this to anyone, for nostalgic reasons. Having read that she had broad hips and strong legs, and her interest in the mountains from the map, I wonder if she may have been an athlete such as a skier. Maybe she visited Norway in 1952 for the Winter Olympics, when she would have been in her early 20s. She was in possession of tourist maps showing locations where the height above sea level had been added to mountain railway stations.
Don't forget also that the Isdal Ice Valley also has a reputation locally for suicides. It's just a 1-hour walk from Bergen.
Indeed. My personal theory, she was suffering from a psychoaffective disorder that included paranoia and delusions. Sufferers often believe that they're being followed or under surveillance, hence the false names. Likely that she would have been treated for this condition at some point in her life. It's probable that she was estranged from what family she had. It's likely that she was someone who did not form close relationships. People, including her neighbours, probably regarded her as an eccentric and a loner.
Those trips she made in 1970 were a consequence of her psychiatric illness. She took her own life while the balance of her mind was disturbed.
It's likely her suicide was planned and had been for some time, and the remote location for the suicide and the destruction of anything to identify her was calculated and deliberate. I don't think she wanted or expected her body to be found for a long time, by which time those suitcases and hotel records would have been destroyed.
We've covered a lot of ground here. We can also state that there have been efforts behind the scenes to exploit any records held by the French in light of this new DNA information, and the suggestion that she originated from the Grand Est region of France. So it may be possible to identify her and ultimately to trace her family.
Yet the Norwegian case is finished. Verdict suicide. Almost certainly correct. No reason to reopen it. Why don't the French take this on? Simple answer. Even if they accept she was a French national, their constitution allows for and respects people's rights to disappear.
With the exception of the disappearance of minors, children, clear-cut cases of kidnapping and disappearances classified as worrisome, such as people suffering from Alzheimer's disease, for example, or in which the circumstances lead the police to believe that the missing person's life is in danger, the French authorities do not investigate missing persons.
Without any indication that the missing person is in danger, no official inquiry can be launched. That's according to a government site that explains to French citizens their rights. You must find the person by yourselves. The site even suggests that social media networks can also be used. An adult person has the right to disappear, and that's how it is in every country in the world, I was told by Alain Bauer, a leading French criminologist who was an advisor to former President Nicolas Sarkozy, former Prime Minister Manuel Valls, and several interior ministers. If you decide tomorrow to move to Patagonia because you're angry at your family, you are permitted to do that and under no obligation to tell anyone. I know this is surprising, but the problem is that we arrived at this policy in the wake of our experience. The police force wore itself out with unnecessary searches for people who hadn't really disappeared, and therefore it was decided to focus on the kidnappings of minors.
Her French nationality is probably correct, but either way, her passport was never found, and we can assume that this was deliberate. She wanted to die remotely and anonymously. She may even have thought the remote location meant she wouldn't have been found for months, maybe years, by which time her suitcase would have been destroyed.
I believe that she had some psychiatric illness that caused her to deny who she really was and to escape from her true self. Her travel to a foreign country helped her achieve this. I also believe that the location of her death was planned in advance, and that she did not want or expect to be found for a considerable time. She may have prepared the scene of her death in advance too. The gasoline may have been left there on an earlier visit. The discovery of her body after several days was quite unusual. Had it not been for the actions of the man and his daughters looking for Juniper and walking off the beaten track, she probably wouldn't have been found for months. If this had been the case, the scene would have deteriorated, the time of death would have been less accurate, and her luggage at the railway station would have been disposed of. The trail back to Stavanger would have been lost. Fenella Lork and the other names through to Elizabeth Lienhalfre may never have been discovered. From my experience of police investigations, this would have been different if Elizabeth Lienhalfre had been a suspect in a serious crime. Then I'm sure that her true identity would have been established by the investigating officers. Had she been a suspect, the detectives would have travelled to the relevant countries and made sure that their investigation was treated with the utmost importance. It's a matter of pride for detectives to get the answers.
Answers that the Norwegian police in 1970 didn't get. The question is, will anyone ever get to answer that question? Who is the Isdal-woman?
Thanks for listening. Join us again soon for another riveting psycho killer true crime investigation.